Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and this is just going to be an overview of the BIOS for the MSI Z390i Gaming Edge AC motherboard. Now, bit of a warning, since there's board BIOSes have a lot of settings, right? And there's a lot of them that I just don't care about because I don't use them. So there's going to be a lot of stuff where I'm just basically going to just point out that it exists and leave it at that, because quite frankly, I probably don't know what it does. Because I've never used it, because I've never needed to use it. So anyway, let's get right into it with the OC tab, where most of the settings I do care about actually are. So starting off with the OC Explore mode, now we have, just set it to expert. Like, honestly, just set it to expert. I don't really see a reason why you'd leave it on normal. Putting it on expert basically just shows you a bunch of settings that otherwise are hidden. Which, you know, like, yeah, I don't know why you'd want them hidden. Next, we have CPU ratio apply mode. There's turbo ratio, which, you know, is your usual, basically, however, core clock based on however many cores are being used, right? So, like, single core, you're going to have, like, 5.2 gigahertz. Two cores, you're going to have, like, 5.2 as well, maybe, let's say, right, or 5.3 or whatever. And then going down, so that you'll basically have a different, like a different core clock based on how many cores are actually loaded. I don't use that because it's a pain to set up. Then we have per core, which you'd think would allow you, well, the way this is supposed to work, I've not managed to get it to work, so I don't know if it does work or if it's just broken. But I've not had any success with making this work in the sense that it would actually give you higher scores. Like, you know, if you set this to like 52, 52, 52, and then 50, 50, 50. So, like, something like, well, okay, let's just go with that, right? Like, let's say I set something like that. So I've tried basically something like that, and it didn't work. So, as in, it scored like absolute garbage. So I can only assume that there's some kind of settings elsewhere that you need to adjust in combination with this for this to work properly, because I can't get it to work properly. So I just use all core mode and not even dynamic, just fixed, because if it's locked in, it can't do weird stuff, right? That's kind of the logic there. Plus the CPU, like, technically, yeah, it's not ideal for your idle power consumption, but you're still not going to be, like, if the CPU is not doing anything, it's not going to be using as much power as if it's actually running a benchmark, okay? Admittedly, if it was not doing much of anything at a gigahertz instead of 5, it would be using a little bit less power, but at that point, we're already using so little power, I don't really, like, personally, I don't care about it. If you really do want the maximum amount of power savings, then you're probably going to want to use dynamic mode, but I personally just use fixed for everything, so yeah. Well, I use fixed because it's convenient. Anyway, next we get CPU ratio offset for AVX. So how much the CPU will slow down under AVX workloads. Next we get ring ratio, which, you know, that's just ratio for your ring. The ring on the LGA 1151 CPUs actually runs off of the V core. So if you set your ring ratio too high, you're going to have to bump up your V-core to stabilize it, which basically means you're going to be pushing more power into the cores, which means you're going to be producing more heat, which is going to basically give you a bad day. So it can make sense to just, like, there's no reason to try push the ring ratio super high, because it does, like, it can massively increase your V-core requirements, and it doesn't really change your performance that much. You know, unless there's, like, a huge gap between your ring ratio and your core clock, it really doesn't matter that much. Like, a gap of like 4.7 to 5.1 gigahertz, going to like going from 4.7 to 5 gigahertz on the ring ratio probably wouldn't make much of a difference to our overall performance, but would require a lot more voltage. If you had a gap more like, say, like if you're on liquid nitrogen, right, you end up in a situation where the core is doing like 6 gigahertz plus, then yeah, you need the ring ratio at around 6 gigahertz so that it can keep up with the core. But if you're ambient, you don't really need to, like, you know, push 5 gigahertz freaking ring ratio. It just makes your power, like, it just makes your V-core requirements much, much higher. Anyway, so, you know, I normally leave it at like 4.8 or 4.7. So we're just going to go for 4.8 here. Next, we get CPU base clock. And interesting thing about this board is that if you leave that on 100 megahertz, it'll actually go to 108 once you're in the operating system. I'm not sure why it does that. It just does that. The best way to get around that is to just set it to 100.01. And then it doesn't do that anymore. Next, we got CPU base clock apply mode. This is really cool. So if we set this to immediate, basically it allows us to adjust the BCLK on the fly in the BIOS. So if you have it set to immediate, you can go into the BIOS and go from like, you can basically adjust the BCLK while sitting in the BIOS, which is kind of cool. But you can't adjust the voltages in the BIOS at the same time, so, you know, the usefulness of this is kind of limited. It can be, like, I've used it to mess around with, like, well, basically when trying to push high memory frequency to see if the next ratio up could maybe possibly work by booting at, like, 4800 and then BCLKing my way to, like, 4900, right? Or something like that. And immediate is super useful for that. Otherwise, next boot, basically, whatever you change the BCLK to will apply after after a reboot. So anyway, we'll leave the auto, which auto is just next boot. So that's kind of that. Next, we get extreme memory profile. You can choose the XMP for your memory kit, right? You'll have profiles depending on how many profiles your memory kit has. Next, we get DRAM reference clock. Now, at high frequencies, my experience is that locking it to 133 megahertz is better. This is basically just like a mid ratio between your memory clock and the BCLK. So this doesn't actually this itself has no impact on performance, but 133 megahertz does tend to give you like from like 4400 megahertz up. The 133 ratio tends to be more stable than anything available on the 100x ratio. So like 4400 you know, is stable. 4533 is a nice stable ratio. 4666 is a nice stable ratio. 100 megahertz, 4500, not a nice stable ratio. Like 4500, I've had issues with work. Like I've had a board where 4500 doesn't work. 4533 does. 4400 does. 4500 doesn't. Just because 4500 is on the 100x, on the 100 megahertz reference clock instead of the 133. So 133 is generally better, better for high frequencies. And speaking of high frequencies, this board is really good at going really fast, and at relatively loose timings. Anyway, next we get memory try it, which just gives us a whole bunch of, like, these only configure your primary settings, so like primary timings. So if we like go to auto and auto on that. Right, if we go to memory, try it like 4800 CL19, as you can clearly see, it doesn't do anything except, does it even? Yeah, it doesn't actually do anything, except set your primary timings up here, right? And this is maybe helpful if you're like very, very new to memory overclocking, but otherwise I find this is just completely bloody useless. So we're going to disable that, going to put ourselves on 133 again, and we're going to go to 4800, and that's going to work. Then we have DRAM timing mode, which we have link and unlink. So if you're in link mode, well, if you're in unlink mode, that's going to be easier. You get memory timings specific to each memory channel. So theoretically, you could get slightly better performance out of one of your memory channels by using the unlinked memory timing mode. It does also mean there's twice as many memory settings to adjust, so you're going to have a lot more work to do. Generally, most of the time, you're going to be just fine using link mode. And unlink is just kind of like if you really want to do more work and potentially gain 0 performance, yeah, you can totally mess around with the unlinked mode. But in linked mode, the timings apply to both memory channels at the same time. So whatever you set for, like, it's set for both at the same time. Unlink gives you the option to set different settings for each. Anyway. And that's a bit brave. Actually, no, it isn't. Oh yeah, and since we're in the memory timing section at this point, this is kind of something neat in my opinion, is that MSI has bumped TRFC into the primary timings, just because this is like a really basic setting to adjust. And they've put TREFI all the way at the top of their timings as well. Like TRFC and TREFI for a lot of other board vendors are like buried in the sub-timing tables. Which is kind of unfortunate because these are by far the easiest two settings to adjust. Like, you lower this one, performance improves, and stability probably doesn't change, at least until around sort of the 300 range on it. And TREFI, basically you raise it, performance improves, and stability doesn't change until you, you won't necessarily see it change your stability until you start exceeding like 40,000 on it. So that's why I'm going with 440,000 here. Like this is pretty much guaranteed to be stable. Maybe not at this speed, right? We're at 4,800 here. So it might not be stable at this speed just because that's a ridiculous speed and that's going to be really taxing on the memory controller. But at lower speeds, 440,000 would work just fine. Anyway, so yeah, and then we get our usual array of memory timings, right? We've got our secondaries here. Tertiaries, more timings. Finally, we get RTLs down here, which basically, like, I don't mess with this. Like, this entire menu may as well not exist. I just leave that one on auto. I've never had a need to mess with that one. Then we have the latency timing configuration for RTL and IOL. Now these are actually, sometimes you do need to mess with these because the board will sometimes just mess up on them. So normally the way they're supposed to look is something like, say, 55, 56, 55, right? And what will sometimes happen, like, for me, what it happens, especially like with this board, I've had it happen at like 3900 CL12. It would do 49, and then this one would be 58, and then it would go 6 and like 14. And that's wrong, okay? For 3900 CL12, the way they're supposed to look is like that, right? And so sometimes you need to manually set it to a correct configuration, and the correct configuration is generally just like, this one is the channel B, RTL for dim 0, rank 0 is 1 tick higher than for channel A. And then channel A dim, IOL is going to be the same for both. So that's kind of how those tend to work out. Most of the time, like for daily usage, you should just be able to leave them auto and not worry about it. Then we get into more advanced sort of memory settings. We have DLL bandwidth. This setting, what's the adjustment range on it? Yeah, so this setting can, like, I leave it on auto generally, but messing around with that can improve very high frequency memory overclocking capabilities, but you're probably best, like, quite frankly, it works fine if you leave it on auto. I've not had any need to, like, manually adjust it yet myself, so yeah. I'd say for daily usage, definitely you can just leave that auto and basically forget that this port that exists. Safe boot retry. I assume this is the reason why this motherboard doesn't get hung up on bad memory settings, so I would not disable that. So yeah, I just leave that enabled, and basically, yeah, that's what I'm gonna say there. If you disable that, I would assume what happens is basically the motherboard stops, like essentially right now, if you punch in a bunch of bad settings, the motherboard doesn't take a very long time to figure out that the settings are bad and throw you back into the BIOS without wiping it. If you disable that, I would assume that it just gets stuck in a boot loop like any Asus motherboard, which is why Asus eventually added like the new memo K-switch, which doesn't really fix the issue because it just makes the board fail memory settings that should work anyway. But anyway, back to this board. DRAM voltage boost. This is a really clunky way to implement DRAM boot voltage. So essentially, this allows you to set a different boot up voltage than a running voltage. So this will apply an offset to your DIMM voltage. So let's say you set your DIMM voltage to say 1.5 volts, but you want to boot up at like 1.6 volts for memory training purposes, or you want to boot up at 1.45 volts for memory training purposes, right? You would use this to set yourself to like 1.45 volts by like setting minus 50 millivolts, or to plus 100 if you wanted to boot at 1.6 volts, right? So essentially it gives you some, it gives you the ability to boot at a higher or lower memory voltage than what you're going to end up running at afterwards. This is really, really clunky, and I've also not had to use it yet. So I don't really mind that it's super clunky, because evidently the board doesn't have massive, like, for example, on like gigabyte motherboards, once you exceed 1.85 volts, you may have major issues with training on some of them. So it makes sense to just like set your boot voltage to 1.85 and then your running voltage to 2 volts. And then you're fine, right? You boot up, you train at 1.85 and then you run at 2 and everything's great. I've not yet had to do anything like that with this board, mostly because this doesn't have VTT DDR, so I can't go all the way to 2 volts anyway. So, you know, who knows? Maybe it would do it if I had a memory kit that would tolerate more tolerate higher voltages. Anyway, then we get a bunch of settings that I straight up don't know what these do. Well, I have a rough idea of what they probably do, but I don't use them, so I'm not gonna like tell you what the purpose of them is. You can read the tooltip over on the side here. It's not that far, like that's as useful a description as I could probably give you. So, yeah. And that includes these, and this one, and not these. So rank interleaving, if you disable this and you have multi-rank memory, you're gonna lose a bit of performance. And I assume this just increases the performance that rank interleaving can give you. So that's that. I've not yet tested multi-rank memory here, but essentially the idea with rank interleaving is that you can do like different operations in parallel on the memory ranks. If you don't know what memory ranks are, that's fine. I have a video about that there. Hopefully I'm going to remember to leave a link to that somewhere under the video, either in the comment section or the description, or maybe even in both, if you know, if on the off chance that I remember. Quite frankly, if you are using dual rank memory, you should have this enabled, and if you're on like single rank memory, well, then it doesn't matter. You can leave it auto, because it won't do anything. Now, on-die termination, these are the termination resistances for the memory sticks, and quite frankly, I've been leaving these auto so far. I've not yet had a reason to try manually set them. It also doesn't help that the board doesn't show you what it sets them to on its own, which is, in my opinion, rather annoying. Because I have had boards where manually configuring these can help quite a bit, but this board seems to, like, I've not had issues hitting 4800 on this motherboard with basically auto everything. So evidently this board knows what it's doing with auto settings a lot of the time. So that's great. Next we get memory fast boot. This is a great way, like, if you have memory fast boot enabled, it'll essentially skip the memory training procedure, which is a good way to trick the motherboard into booting settings that shouldn't work. It's also a terrible, like, it's also bad for memory stability. So for daily usage, you should just leave that on auto, which is disabled. And then if you're, you know, messing around with sketchy memory overclocks, then you might want to enable it for doing things like, say, training at 4000 megahertz and then enabling fast boot, right? So you would first disable it, do your settings at 4000 megahertz, then you would go to 4133, enable it, and not touch anything. And if you're lucky, it'll get you into Windows at a higher frequency than it should be functional. Because otherwise, you know, like 4133 could have been failing otherwise. But the thing is, if you do that, it generally means the memory settings are really, really unstable. If you need to, if you need to do this to get into Windows with a set of memory settings, then they're pretty bad in terms of stability. So general, like, not useful for day-to-day usage. Next we get VRM settings. This is called digital all power, but as far as I know, this voltage controller is partially analog, so that's not entirely true. But anyway, we got load line calibration settings. Unfortunately, this board, well, I've not yet managed, like, I've not gotten around to, like, validating the voltage readouts on this motherboard. I think they're pretty far off just based off of the power consumption and temperatures that this board runs at. As in, Like, if I set the LLC to, like, mode 5, which according to this lovely graph we have over on the side here, you would think that's a very slight amount of V-droop. In terms of the temperatures I end up at and the power consumption compared to other boards where I have validated the voltage, this has to be a ton of V-droop. Like, a ridiculous amount of freaking V-droop. Because it runs so damn cool at that setting. It's unreal. Now, if you bump it all the way up... So, basically, I've been testing with mode 2 so far, because that seems to be the closest to what I have on other motherboards. But, yeah, for some reason on this graph, it's shown as a whole bunch of voltage boost. Which, admittedly, if you use the Super I/O chip for voltage readouts, yeah, it definitely shows the voltage going up under load. But the Super I/O chip, I'm pretty sure the Super I/O reads the voltage before the CPU socket. And the CPU socket, especially on like a 9900K, which is a very high current CPU once you start pushing it, proves to be a pretty massive piece of resistance, and you lose a whole bunch of voltage just going through the CPU socket. So while mode 2 on here, like, basically I need to validate the voltage readings on this, because right now it's a bit of a mess. But we do have a lot of LLC settings. And as a general rule of thumb, I would still just stick with, like, mode 2 or 3 anyway. Next, we have CPU over voltage protection. You can just max that out. CPU under voltage protection, you can just max that out. CPU over current protection, you can just max that out. CPU switching frequency, you can't max this one out because the VRM is, well, it's small. It's an ITX motherboard. There's not a lot of space to put a lot of phases. There's not a lot of space to put a lot of heat sinks. So essentially, this board does have, like, I'm already in the process of doing VRM thermal testing. I've been testing at 375 kilohertz because that's a good, like, basically, if you set the switching frequency too low, it will improve your VRM efficiency. It'll also potentially ruin your overclocking because you're going to have a whole bunch of output ripple from the VRM. So I've been testing at 375 kilohertz because that's a comparable switching frequency to the other ITX motherboard I've tested, which runs at 400 kilohertz on its 6-phase. This is also a 6-phase. So, yeah. Anyway, going all the way up to like 687 kilohertz, you're going to have major already at 375, it's not exactly a cool running VRM. So at like 687, it's just going to run stupid hot. And, you know, if you're on like an i5-9600K, sure. Or if you have a fan like strapped to the VRM and, you know, blasting a lot of air through it, then yeah, you can go up to 687 kilohertz. True, 687 kilohertz too. But generally, you probably don't want to do that, and you're going to want to stick around that 250 to 300. Like these three frequencies right here are going to be optimal for most use cases. So anyway, I'm going to put that to 375. CPU VRM over temperature. Unfortunately, we don't get an extensive set of options for the over temperature setting, which is rather annoying because if you have this enabled, the OTP kicks in at 100 degrees. Like basically, the board starts thermal throttling at 100 degrees. If you disable it, it doesn't thermal throttle at all, but there's now no over temperature protection, which basically means the board is not gonna do anything as the VRM gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So I would generally just like, essentially the board forces you into having good VRM cooling because otherwise the VRM thermal throttles. So that's kind of that. Anyway, next we get a whole bunch of iGPU settings, which you can just not bother with because you're not overclocking the iGPU anyway, even if you are using it. So next we get CPU core and iGPU voltage mode. So there's adaptive mode, override mode, offset mode, adaptive plus offset, and override plus offset. I use override mode for the same reason that I have a fixed CPU ratio. Wait, that's dynamic. There. Fixed. Literally. So that's kind of that. Now we get to system agent and I/O voltage. So these are both memory controller voltages. As a general rule of thumb, you don't really want more than a 50 millivolt gap between the two of these. So like 1.2 SA, and you'd want like 115 or 125 for I/O voltage. Now, interestingly enough, MSI has their like red voltage levels set really low. on this motherboard, which I assume is a combination of this motherboard plus I don't know, they might be being a little bit overly safe. Anyway, theoretically, if you could cool it, a 9900K would be safe all the way up to 1.42 volts. Realistically, you're not going to be able to cool it at that point, so you're not going to run it at that voltage anyway. So, yeah, at least you're not going to be able to cool it at 1.42 volts running any kind of AVX workload. Which, considering what AVX instructions are like the greatest improvement in CPU performance in the last couple years, I think AVX is just going to get steadily more popular, not less so. So, you know, running your CPU at settings where AVX doesn't work is probably a bad idea for the future, because AVX is really freaking fast. That's also part of why it's so freaking power hungry. Anyway, for system agent, like MSI has the red level just set right above 1.2 volts. For IO voltage, they have it set right above 1.15 volts, which is really low, because if you're going over, like, let's say you're pushing frequencies in like the 4400 megahertz range, you might need close to, say, 1.25 or even 1.3 volts system agent and IO voltage, and that's fine. Like, honestly, like, as long as you stay under 1.35 volts for both of these, you're gonna do fine. Like, you also generally don't need even 1.35 volts, but for like most people, just 1.25 volts for most frequencies is gonna work fine. You might need around 1.3 once you're going into the 4400 range and higher. But otherwise, you really shouldn't be pushing these too high, because if you do set these really, really high, you're actually going to break the CPU's memory controller. And they don't roll over. So basically, what I mean by they don't roll over is with, say, Ryzen, if you set the SoC voltage too high, you lose stability. With System Agent and IO, I've never seen a situation where more System Agent didn't help. Okay, though I have also degraded, have managed to degrade a memory controller on a 7700K with that approach to setting system agent voltage. So, that's kind of that. Like, it will degrade the CPU, but it doesn't, start, you don't start losing stability by setting these too high, but it's definitely not ideal to just run them as high as possible. So, try to, I wouldn't, worry about, minimizing them, but don't don't whack them to 1.4 volts. Okay, just don't do that, because that's not good. But on the flip side, there's no reason to, inch them down by 10 millivolts, checking stability every step of the way. I would generally just sort of start at something like that, and just leave, and if this is stable at whatever settings I'm running, I'm leaving it there. Right, I'll just leave it like that and never worry about it again. Because the other thing is, neither of these rails really pulls that much power either. So, since neither of them pulls that much power, they really don't affect your CPU temperature that much anyway. So, yeah, I really wouldn't worry about those. Anyway, next we got some PLL voltages. So CPU PLL OC voltage, I advise you to not touch that one. It affects CPU temperature monitoring, and it doesn't help with, slightly raising it can sometimes help with stabilizing CPU core clock. Sometimes. Very, very rarely. So I would just recommend you leave it on auto and just forget that it exists, okay? This voltage really doesn't do much of anything. And the same goes for all of these. In fact, my experience with MC, SA, and these 4 voltages right here, which all of them are default value is 0.9. So all of these 0.9 voltages, my experience with trying to raise them has been that it makes things worse, not better. CPU ST voltage, slightly bumping this up to say 1.1 volts. Can help with stabilizing memory overclocks sometimes. Most of the time, if you're not at some ridiculous frequency, you probably don't have to bother with it at all. And by ridiculous frequency, I mean over 4,000 megahertz, and a lot over 4,000 megahertz. So anyway, that's that. DRAM voltage up to 1.5 volts is safe for daily usage, but because this motherboard is actually like, this motherboard is surprisingly good at memory overclocking, and MSI's actually used this motherboard to like smash a whole bunch of memory frequency records. This board goes very high on memory voltage. There, that's where it tops out. That's more than enough to destroy memory sticks and potentially memory controllers as well. So definitely don't go that high. For daily usage, you're really going to want to stick to around 1.5 volts. PCH voltage, you're never, like, there's never a reason to mess with that one. It doesn't do anything, so it's just for the chipset. You don't need to worry about it. So yeah. The only voltage missing from the voltage settings here is VTT DDR, which I'm pretty annoyed about because, as you all may know, I have a bunch of memory kits that don't like if the VTT DDR is, like, that have a very specific requirement for VTT DDR once you start pushing high VDIM. And MSI just, like, it's an ITX board, they have limited space, they decided not to bother with implementing a adjustable VTT DDR rail. So there's no VTT DDR control, which, basically it rules out my, like, it ruins my ability to do memory overclocking on this motherboard because my memory sticks, once the VTT DDR gets too high, that's it. It's over, right? And when you don't have adjustable VTT DDR, the way it's configured is it just runs half VDIM, which works fine until you're trying to push close to 2 volts. So yeah. Anyway, next we get CPU memory change detect. So basically you can disable, like, basically if you have this enabled and you swap out memory sticks or the CPU, the motherboard will tell you that the CPU has been changed or the memory's been changed on boot up. If you disable this, it'll just boot up like nothing has changed. That's all that really does. Next we have OC Quick View Timer. I have no idea what that does. I assume it puts a delay on the Windows boot logo so that you have time to mash the delete button. That's my guess on what that does. I've not actually checked. I don't particularly care. You know, it works fine on 3 seconds. Then we got CPU specifications, which just tells us a bunch of information about the CPU. Memory Z, which just reads out the SPD profiles of our memory sticks. Right, including the XMP profiles, not much useful there either. Then we have a bunch of CPU features, and so here we can do things like disable and enable hyperthreading, change how many cores we have running, do whatever that does, do whatever this does, do whatever, well, actually, like, enable and disable the virtualization extensions, right? So usually when I'm benchmarking, I have those disabled just because I don't need them. Then whatever this does, and whatever that does, and whatever this does, and whatever... Actually, this enables and disables the thermal sensors. C states, you know, you can disable your C states, enable your C states, all that good stuff. C1E support, enable, disable. C state limit, so you can control how low, like what C states the CPU can use. Whatever that does, I don't know. I don't really care. Long duration power limit, which we solve like that. Long duration maintained, so how long we can allow that power limit for, which we don't care about because we do this. Then we have a current limit for the CPU, which we also just max out. CPU over temperature protection. So, as I mentioned earlier, if you set your CPU to like a 9900K to high voltage and you run like an AVX enabled stress test, you're going to have a hell of a time cooling it, which means your stress test is going to potentially be invalid if the CPU is thermal throttling the entire damn time. So, you know, if you're not hitting the clock speed you're going to be running at, you're not actually stress testing. You're just, well, you're not really achieving much of anything. You're just thermal throttling. So, you can change the thermal throttle point. The issue with this is if you have a workload that consistently is hitting temperatures that would normally thermal throttle, you should not like be raising your over temperature protection, okay? Because the reason why the over temperature protection exists is because at high temperatures, CPUs degrade faster, okay? So really, like, only use this for, like, you know, basically the way I see this is useful if you're like a gamer and you have a 9900K and you want to stress test it with an AVX workload. Okay. And then, so when you're stress testing with your AVX workload, you just max out the over temperature protection. They even tell you that, you know, it's damaged if you run the CPU too hot, which is especially true when you're at high voltage. Okay, because basically, well, I'm gonna like basically degradation is a combination. CPUs degrade due to a combination of core voltage and operating temperature. More core voltage, more degradation. More operating temperature, more degradation. So if you combine high core voltage with very high, you know, operating temperature, you get like maximum amounts of degradation. So this is really bad for long-term use. But if you're just going to run a stress test for like, you know, 2 hours, and then you're going to put your thermal limit back down to auto, right? And then you're just going to keep those settings knowing that, okay, if, you know, I get some kind of, if I ever run anything AVX, it's just going to thermal throttle, which is going to admittedly suck when that happens, but, you know, is better than roasting the CPU. So yeah, that's like one way to, but you know, if you're not actually using anything that'll consistently thermal throttle, then that's kind of the use case for this setting. Otherwise, you shouldn't be using it, right? If you're rendering 24/7 and that render is hitting 115 degrees Celsius, your chip's probably not going to last very long, because yeah, they're like, yeah, okay, so that's kind of that. Then we get FCLK frequency. I don't remember what exactly this is, but messing with this can sometimes help with memory overclocking. Generally speaking, you should leave it on auto. Then we have DMI link speed, so you can configure the speed of the PCIe connection between the CPU and the chipset. There's essentially, like Intel calls it the DMI, it's essentially a 4x PCIe connection from the CPU to the chipset. And yeah, you can change if it's Gen 1, Gen 2, or Gen 3. Or Gen 3. You should obviously leave it, you know, you can just leave it auto or just leave it on Gen 3, because that link is 4 PCIe lanes wide, and if you have anything that's like, say, a very fast M.2 SSD on the other end, like hooked up to the chipset, and you have this on like Gen 1 or Gen 2, you're going to be bottlenecking your M.2 SSD. So, you know, Gen 3 or auto is the only valid settings for that one. Software guard extensions, whatever those do, I don't know, don't really care. And then we have speed shift, which you can, which I personally, well, considering everything else I've done, it doesn't matter, but you can enable that or disable that as well, which is some power management stuff from Intel. So that covers the OC tab. Next, let's take a look at this, which is the Board Explorer, which is this horrible mouse-controlled mess. So we shall quickly leave that. Well, it's somewhat useful, right? Like, you can look at things and it'll tell you stuff about various things around the board. So, yeah, like what's plugged into what. But, yeah, it's not ideal because it's mouse controlled. Anyway, hardware monitor. Here you can adjust your fan speeds, and pump speeds, and, yeah, that's kind of that. And unfortunately, this also relies entirely on mouse control. I mean, it's not too bad. It's not like MSI's mouse control in the BIOS is definitely by far not the worst. Okay, I think the worst would probably be Gigabyte. Using a mouse in a Gigabyte BIOS is, well, it's like shooting yourself in the foot repeatedly. But yeah, here, like, this works fine. It's just not, you know, ideal, as far as I'm concerned. Personally, I think everything in the BIOS should be controllable with just the keyboard, but this is definitely not the worst mouse control implementation, so I'm willing to tolerate it. Anyway, next we get some OC profiles. So, yeah, if you want to, now the thing is, if you want to set names for profiles, you have to do it from here. Right, so we can go like that, and you can save a profile, then you can load a profile, you can clear a profile, right, so you can just wipe the settings in it. Also, if you want to load a profile quickly, you can do it from the F8 key, and if you want to save a profile quickly, you can do it from the F9 key. So that's kind of that. Then you can also say, you know, you can choose to load profiles like that. You can save profiles to your USB stick because obviously there's not a lot of, like, either if you want to share a profile with somebody else who has the same board as you to help them out with, say, memory settings or something, or if you've just run out of memory, like if you've just run out of profiles on the board itself, which I tend to do a lot these days, is I just save so many damn profiles that, you know, I like... that I end up saving them on a USB stick just because there's so damn many of them and they no longer fit on the board. Yeah, you can save to USB and load from a USB stick as well. So that's that. Oh yeah, we have a bunch of options up here, which we have an auto overclocking option, which I would recommend you do not use. And then we have XMP enable disable, and then we have right, there's a boot manager, so that's that. You can go to easy mode, and I guess change language. Yeah, you can change language, and then leave. So anyway, let's go into the settings here. We get system status, which tells us a bunch of information about the system, all very useful, I'm sure. Then we have some advanced settings. So we have some PCIe stuff. You know, so PCIe link speed, we have PCI latency timer, which I've never seen before, so I have no idea what this does. Also, there's no PCI slot on the board. What? That's interesting. And then we have an option for if you want to run a lot of GPUs for crypto mining. And the help has disappeared. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so we go there. Yeah. So, you know, for it, like, I don't know why you do use this on a ITX board, but it is there. And I've never tested if that works myself. So I don't know if it does, but it does exist. So it might work, might not. Then we have, you know, these settings right here. So you can set an alarm if the CPU gets too hot, so that the board buzzes at you if you have the buzzer plugged in, because the board doesn't actually come with one physically attached, like soldered on. I wonder if it's in the accessory pack. It might be. I'm not sure. I've not checked. Anyways, there's LEDs on this? I gotta tell you, I don't know what LEDs that controls, because I can't see any, but okay, that exists. Then we have integrated peripherals settings, so, you know, you can enable, disable your LAN and audio and your SATA, and you can, yeah. So that's kind of that. Then we have integrated graphics settings, so you can choose if you boot off of the iGPU or the PCIe GPU. And then multi-monitor functionality for the integrated graphics cards. Oh yeah, to output from both at the same time, and then memory options for the iGPU. Actually, if we go to, so that's that. Then we have some USB settings. Right. So there's that. Next we have some power management stuff. So that's that. And we have some Windows stuff, including MSI's fast boot, which is apparently even faster than regular fast boot. I've not checked either of them, so I wouldn't know. Then we have wake up options, right? Which, like, that just is like a time-based one. PCIe devices, LAN, USB devices. So, yeah. And then we have secure erase, which is a, like an SSD erase feature from MSI. I've never actually used this, because there's, like, you can use, like, you can use, like, you can whack Linux on a flash stick and use that to wipe a to wipe a SSD. So, yeah. I've just forgotten what you call a bootable USB stick with Linux on it, so, yeah. Anyway, moving on. Next, we have some boot options. There's a lot of settings here. Wait, does this thing have a speaker? Did I miss it? Oh, well. Yeah, so full screen logo. Go to BIOS. So allows you to enter the BIOS setup directly by pressing the power button for 4 seconds. Oh, that's actually pretty neat. So auto set your num lock, info block effects. That's the... Yeah, basically you get a bunch of boot settings, and then you have legacy plus UEFI or UEFI only mode. Here you can see a bunch of, well, here you can set your boot order. And do they have override? Oh no. You can actually just click on whatever you want to boot from up there. So you can choose which, you know, which drives have priority, USBs have priority, hard disks, floppy drives have priority as well. So that's all very standard. Then we have some security settings, so you can set a password for the BIOS, trusted computing, which I've never messed with, so I don't know anything about this part of the BIOS. So, yeah, not going to be much help here. Those are the options that exist. There. And then you have chassis intrusion, which is for detecting if somebody opened the case, if you have that set up, which I've never messed with, so, you know, I'll just leave that disabled. Then we got save and exit, where you can discard changes and exit, save changes and reboot, save changes, discard changes, restore your, you know, restore your defaults, so just wipe the BIOS back to stock. And then, of course, boot override to force the system to boot to one of these devices from the BIOS. So, yeah, at this point, I'm just going to hit F10. And we're going to see if that 4800 megahertz memory clock is going to work. Which it should, because I've done this over and over again so far. So, let's go for it. Oh, I apparently changed something in the fan headers. Oh, and the BIOS does give you this nice summary of all the things you changed. So, yeah. Well, that's freaking stupid. Oh, I set it to CL18. Actually, no, that's not what's causing it. I know what's causing it. I set the VCCIO way too low. And VCCSA. Anyways, as you can clearly see, the board's actually really good about recovering from bad settings. Because it just gives you this screen, you hit F1, and bam, we're back in the BIOS, and all of our settings are still here, so we can correct our, yeah, major mistake right there. There, all good. Yeah, and 4800 megahertz, just like that. So, yeah, I'm actually really impressed with that. I never thought, like, when I first tried this, just setting it to 4800 and seeing if it would post, yeah, I never expected it to actually work, but it does. So I'm actually quite impressed by that, though I do have one complaint. 1T command rate doesn't seem to work at very high memory frequencies. So, like, I've not managed to I've not yet had 1T working at like 4133, which is on a lot of other boards that actually works just fine. So the board seems to be a little bit, like, it can clock really, really high, but it seems to prefer kind of looser timings than well, actually, no, it's really just the command rate that's really been kind of weird like that, where it's a bit higher than I'm used to for any given frequency. Like, at 4800 being 2T is fine, that's normal. Like, I don't think there's any board out there that can do 1T at 4800 megahertz, but 1T at 4400 I've done at least on one board. So, yeah. Whereas I've not done that on this one. So, yeah. Anyway, that is it for the video. So, thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, then I've got a Patreon. There's also a Teespring where you can buy shirts and like socks, and there's also stickers. So yeah, and all of those help out with running the channel immensely. So if you'd like to support the channel through, you know, either like directly through Patreon or by buying something off of Teespring, that would be awesome. There's links to both down in the description below. And that is it for the video. And I think I forgot to mention that MSI provided this motherboard. It's on loan. I don't get to keep it. So anyway, yeah, that is it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.